I am so glad you convinced me that the family car should be the Defender 110. It is so beautiful inside, it's so comfortable, and it just feels indestructible.
Yes, it really is. I've been waiting a long time for the new model to come out. The Defender 110, I'm telling you, it's my favorite car of all times. It's my third one. You know, I have stories of going off road. The guy managed the group. He was like, "What are you doing in this beautiful car?" I'm like, "I'm going off road." He's like, "Are you sure? Because you can use one of ours." And then they look like Mad Max cars. I'm like, no, we're going to do this. And he was shocked.
Wow. Well, it's great because the Defender has been reimagined for 21st century adventure, and its unparalleled off-road ability as well as its robust interior are invaluable whether you're headed towards uncharted territory or just a weekend of exploration. The Defender 110 tackles challenging surroundings with absolute confidence. The SUV conveys strength outside and in, featuring peerless technology like an intuitive driver display and an award-winning infotainment system. That's my favorite part, to keep you connected no matter where the journey takes you. Adventure is unique to everyone, and so is the Defender. Choose from the two-door Defender 90, the four-door Defender 110, or the larger Defender 130 with the ability to seat up to 8 passengers. You'll find uncompromising performance in all three. So pack up and go even further with the Defender 110. Learn more at LandRoverUSA.com/Defender.
These days, we're all investors, trying to be smart with our money despite our worst impulses. But at iShares, we believe that deep down inside of every investor is a better investor. One that's just waiting to be let out. Explore iShares ETFs and insights and let your best investor out. Visit iShares.com for more information.
This isn't your average business podcast, and he's not your average host. This is the James Altucher Show.
So, Brian, one theory that's a little bit separate from all the physics and scientific theories, and it's a theory I feel like anyone could engage in the speculation of it, is the idea that the universe, the entire universe, is really a simulation. Some other civilization's virtual reality that we inhabit, as if we're the characters or the avatars in some giant universal-sized game. And from what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, the idea is, we've only been playing with virtual reality for what, 40 years, 30 years? And it's already, like when I put on a VR headset, it's pretty good. I could see it's not the real world, but it's not bad. So the idea is, imagine if a civilization has been around for 1 billion years and playing around with VRs. Their simulations would be perfect, and they would have billions and billions and trillions of simulations around, of which the real universe is only one universe, and then all these other simulations, trillions, are other universes. So the odds are almost probable that we're a simulation. If the real universe is only 1 out of 1 trillion, the odds are we're in a simulation of another much more advanced civilization.
Well, I love this idea, not necessarily because I think it's likely to be true, although the question of how one could resolve it relies on me not being able to have a strong opinion in its favor.
Well, why is that?
Well, I think that, it's part of the sort of illusion of free will that some say we have actual free will. And what's so interesting to me about the simulation hypothesis is that it connects to so many different aspects. First of all, the cosmological one that you just talked about. Secondly, it talks about, it eventually gets into prospects for artificial intelligence, virtual reality, Moore's law, scalability, technology. Remember, one of the taglines of our founding namesake of the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination, Sir Arthur C. Clarke, where I'm the co-director, I run the Into the Impossible podcast. Arthur Clarke said, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So you could just replace magic with artificial intelligence, and you could actually increase that according to Moore's law. And it wouldn't take very long until there's a certain amount of computing power that would be superseded, and we'd get past the bottleneck to any technological objections that could be made.
So first off, let me ask you, when was the first time you've ever used a virtual reality?
The first time I ever used it was probably 8 years ago. Google Cardboard started to come along. Augmented reality, maybe it was 7 years ago, something like that.
Okay, I'm approximately 1992.
Wow.
Where I used a virtual reality. Went to a place like a warehouse, and I get in a booth, and someone else gets in a booth, and you're suddenly in this virtual reality, and it's a shoot 'em up. You could run around and you shoot the other person, and maybe there aren't as many points of clarity. I don't know what you call it in a VR, but suffice to say, 30 years later, virtual reality is so much closer to like a real world. Like if you're walking on a plank now in a VR, you feel like afraid of heights. Like you feel like you're gonna fall off the plank and hurt yourself. Like it's so your brain interprets it so real. But the disconnect with reality is that if you do this for 30 minutes, your brain realizes, oh, wait a second, I've been tricked. This is not really a reality. I'm
It's
going to
too
make this
real.
person sick.
Right.
And so you start to feel nauseous.
Yeah.
And I had to give a talk once in a virtual reality. There are hundreds of people from all over the world.
Wow.
And after about a half hour, 45 minutes, I really was feeling ill, nauseous.
Yeah.
But the technological objection is that the complexity you would need requires more atoms in the universe than exist. That's the technical objection I've heard. But Moore's law implies that we solve that problem in ways that we don't yet know. Like, for instance, quantum computing would solve that problem.
Potentially. And actually, those kinds of objections are not the fundamental kind of resistance that I come up with. I actually think there are other objections that make it much more delightful to consider. And for example, let's say you just knew that there is that you're part of there is a full virtual reality simulation occurring on the Vanuatu Island off of Easter Island or whatever. And I don't even know if that's where it is, but just I picked the name out. So there's an island, and all the inhabitants there are living in a virtual reality simulation. They're actually connected. They have feeding tubes. They have implants in their brain.
Matrix style.
Yeah, it's Matrix style, but you're controlling it. You, James Altucher, are controlling it. So the question then comes up, well, what obligations do you have to these living individuals? In other words, they're actually living. They are not simulations. They're inhabiting a simulation. And the question is, do you have ethical obligations, moral obligations to treat the simulation, not unplug them, make sure that they don't feel physical pain, or maybe they should feel physical pain as part of the virtual reality's realism level setting on number 10. So it brings up all sorts of philosophical, moral objections, potentially, or quandaries that could be present. Can you turn it off? Do you have to have an uninterruptible power supply? What if they find out about this? What if there are clues left in there? How much risk analysis has to go into them avoiding finding out about it because of what would happen to them? So it's funny because a lot of these things eventually lead to almost an omnipotent power in the simulators. And I actually gave a talk about this to an atheist organization called the Sunday Assembly. There's a couple of dozen clubs like this around the world. I call it an atheist church. They meet on Sunday mornings. It's for secular atheist people. And I gave a talk about it on Easter, about the very first Easter egg, which was in the game called Adventure on the Atari 2600.
I remember that very well.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite games of all time, even today.
Yeah.
And there was an Easter egg. Do you remember this? Did you ever discover the Easter egg in it?
Probably. I mean, I'm looking back to when I was 12 years old, or
Yeah.
probably 12 or 13 years old.
Yeah, I was in the early 80s. The thing that's so interesting about that Easter egg is that you couldn't really publicize it, maybe on a bulletin board or something like that. But the people that played console video games weren't on bulletin boards as much. But anyway, I found out about it from my cousin, as most things do. And it was a little pixel, and you dragged it around the screen, and eventually got past the dragons, and you made it inside the castle, and you got it to a secret chamber, which you pushed the controller, this little vertical joystick, up into the upper left corner or whatever, and the pixel got dropped off, and it said, created by Warren Robinette. And I was thinking, telling these atheists about this simulation on Easter, about the very first Easter egg, and how similar that is to the 17th century philosopher René Descartes. So René Descartes is very famous for the phrase cogito ergo sum, which means I think, therefore I am. And that resolution was to the question of whether or not he or any person could potentially distinguish their existence from a mere brain in a jar. he actually talks about the possibility that he is not a living creature with free will and organizational abilities and so forth, and that he is actually a brain in a jar fed stimulation. This is back in the 1700s or whatever. And he resolves that by saying, no, I can prove that I am not because I think. Therefore, I exist. That's the meaning of it. But people forget, it's like a lot of these quotes, people forget the second half of the sentence, like love thy neighbor as thyself. The next sentence is because I am the Lord your God. And the next part of that sentence by Rene Descartes involves God. He basically says God would not let somebody experience the process of thought and have it be for naught, so to speak. In other words, God is perfect. He's not wasteful. So in other words, he resolved it, but only through invoking the invocation of a all-powerful, omniscient being called God. And so I think it's very interesting that the simulation hypothesis also kind of posits that we could currently be brains in a jar, an internet jar, and not fed by liquid nutrients, but fed by electrical currents. And but still the exact same possibility remains that we may not be able to distinguish it but for the existence of some higher power, master simulator, Warren Robinette, or God.
Right. So imagine it from the point of view that we as a civilization are not in a simulation, but that we're going to create one that is so realistic, the inhabitants of it think that they're in an entire universe that had a big bang, that whatever. So you could imagine as technology progresses, like you were saying earlier with Moore's Law, we could eventually make computer worlds kind of like we do now with computer games, but with full VR realistic capabilities. And people in our civilization, other humans, could decide, oh, I want to be in this VR, and I don't want to remember anything. Just I'm going to play this VR, and they can go in it and live a full lifetime, and have telescopes that could see the trillions of light years away or whatever, and then they die, and then they wake up in the real civilization, like welcome back from the game. Or there's the flip side, which is so we could be now in one of those simulations as I had just described. But the other thing is too, you're sort of it calls into question of what is human. So you just said a brain in a jar, and you're still human enough to enter into a simulation, which is this imaginary world created by the simulation civilization that made it. But there's also the fact that we, assuming there is a singularity where computers somehow eventually become conscious in a similar way to what we regard as humans, we also could just be fake characters. There might be only 10 real people from that simulation civilization in this universe. They're playing the game, and we're just characters running around in that simulated universe that we're just powered by this billion-year civilization's version of AI, which is much more sophisticated than ours.
Yeah. So, the simulation argument, again, it's an ancient one in a certain sense. There's a claim that there's some sort of a Chinese mythology from the 500 to 400 BC period called the butterfly dream, which is this master is dreaming that he was a butterfly and he didn't know that he was actually himself, and it's kind of beautiful artwork and goes along with it. And it's sort of a notion that how do you know that you know? In fact, that's what Homo sapien means. It means a man that knows that he knows. And it could mean that that you're going to die, right? Humans are the only animals that we know that are conscious of their own existence and their own demise. And that colors everything we do, according to many psychologists. But the question of, is this actually possible for a computer simulation? Of course, there could be other simulations. You don't need a computer to have the butterfly dream, and certainly they didn't. And what Ostrom originally came up with was not really to prove that we are living in a simulation, but it would be that the natural consequences of advanced artificial intelligence could make such a thing possible. And so now the question of the likelihood of that, of each person, once you get to this level of existing in a perceived reality, but actually existing in simulation, he claims that is extremely high. Now, there's a lot of...
Right, because of this trillion to one. If most of the quote unquote worlds out there are simulations, the odds are we're in one.
Yeah, right.
And the odds are that civilization that created this simulation they're also in a simulation.
And he says, yeah, unless we are now living in a simulation, our descendants will almost certainly never run an ancestor simulation. In other words, what would be the motivation of a simulation to simulate, a 4th century peasant in the northwest outskirts of London or something? But we feel like we're extremely important. Like, I'd wonder, well, why aren't there more Kardashians? It's like, why would you simulate people that aren't of note? Like everybody who's been reincarnated is always like a noble woman. Shirley MacLaine was like, she was a noble woman in the 1400s in Paris. But they're never like, I was a milkmaid, in South Africa and then I died. It's always like I was basically the equivalent of a Kardashian. Now there can't be that many. It's like how many people say they were at Woodstock or remember that they were at Woodstock is 80 times higher than the number of people that are actually at Woodstock. So I think, the simulation hypothesis that is most interesting to me is on cosmological grounds. And this has been brought up by a friend of mine, Sean Carroll, who's been on my podcast. He says effectively that if a civilization is capable of performing a simulation, it will likely perform many simulations, which would then imply that we might be the lowest level of simulation. And then it would be impossible from the lowest level to perceive that such an advanced simulation is possible to conduct. In other words, we wouldn't have a glimpse of what it's like to make an advanced simulation. It would kind of be like me explaining it to my 2-year-old twins, what a simulation is. They don't know. They don't know the difference between real reality and virtual reality. So from my point of view, though, can the simulation hypothesis be falsified? That's actually an interesting question. In other words, if you could falsify it, then that's a cosmology, that's a Big Bang that we can rule out and say, now we can devote our attention to other arguments.
So the falsification that I've heard is related to this idea that to create an entire universe, you would need a computer that has more atoms than exist in the universe. That's the only falsification I've seen, which seems to me to be easily combated by saying, we have no idea of the physics of the universe that's the civilization that's creating the simulation.
Right.
We also don't know. Maybe maybe they're so far advanced, they've lived each person there lives for 1 trillion years each. And for them, they've been running this simulation. They started it off with the Big Bang. And to answer your question, everything has just sort of evolved out of that. So it's not like they've said, hey, let's make everybody a Kim Kardashian or Napoleon. It's just
that's the unmoved mover. That's the Aristotelian unmoved mover that created the universe and then disappeared. So what you said is a plausibility argument. It's implausible, according to some, for an advanced technological civilization to create such an advanced supercomputer. But again, if you ask the guy who wrote the Butterfly Dream poem in 476 BC, he was painting watercolor on parchment or whatever, skins or whatever. If you asked him, well, like, what do you think about a D-wave 100 millikelvin supercomputer based on quantum qubits? What are you talking about? Like, the level of comprehension is so far beyond what someone would be able to even envision. So I don't view that as a fundamental falsification. That's a plausibility. And you could say, what was the odds that going from your 1992 virtual reality that we'd have, holograms that can, represent faithfully a cave in the Middle East or something. And so we have these amazing VR, but it's sort of, it wouldn't be impossible for you to envision it the way it would be impossible for the guy who wrote the Butterfly Dream 2,500 years ago to conceive of a quantum computer. But so that's not a fundamental objection. No, the way to falsify it would be to think about what would be the limitations of any simulation. Let's just say Moore's law continues indefinitely to the future. By the way, one of the weaknesses of that argument is that actually the power of supercomputers is not going up at Moore's law. I don't know if you are aware of this, but even though the ordinary commodity computer chip capability is increasing, doubling roughly every 18 months or so, the actual performance of high throughput computers, aka supercomputers or high performance computers at the highest levels is actually slowly saturating. In other words, it's getting better, but the increment is far, far below Moore's law. And the reason for that's very interesting because as these things get more capable, more people want to use it. more people think of ways to use this vast power of computing. And so the actual resources get taxed in terms of the overhead for every computation. Yes, they can do the calculation in a nanosecond, but it might take the graduate student 10 years to program the code. My graduate students, that would be a short PhD thesis for them, but they're screaming at me. But the fact is, how do we know that that this isn't going to continue? If you plot the rate of use of these supercomputers, it's going to go up too. So you've got a source of improved computing power, but you have this vast sink that everyone wants to simulate everything. Once you have this powerful computer, like I always joke when I'm sitting with one of my students, I'll ask them to do some calculation or whatever, but just like arithmetic. And then they'll take out a calculator. I'm like, you're sitting in front of like the most powerful device ever invented for computation. Why don't you make use of this spreadsheet or, run a Python code to calculate the tangent of some angle, but they'll take out a calculator, whatever. So the point is that as they get more powerful, they get more utilized, and that decreases the net number of computations. So it's not the number of computations, it's the number of floating point operations that can be done or instructions that can be run. That's item number one. But every instruction at some level is discretized. In other words, even a quantum computer eventually has to produce a classical result, which can be translated into, what's running these quantum computers? They're not being run by quantum computers. They're attached to a computer station just like we're talking on. And so eventually it has to be translated into discrete zeros and ones that can then be transmitted and decoded. So that means there's a fundamental resolution, right? There's a fundamental discretization of information that we perceive. It might be 4K resolution, 8K resolution, but it's not going to be infinite resolution. In other words, there'll be stars that will send light out at certain angles, but a simulation could potentially produce 10 to the 10 to the 120 different trajectories, but it can't make an infinite number of them. In other words, there are certain things that are fundamentally analog and are very difficult to reproduce in our analog to digital conversion problem.
Oh my gosh, I love these clothes. Mizzen and Main, that's Mizzen and Main. It really is the most comfortable work clothes. Travel clothes. I had to travel this whole week. I'm traveling for a week and a half, and I just took Mizzen and Main clothes with me. Close out 2023 in style with comfortable, breathable, packable, and machine washable pieces from Mizzen and Main. As you wrap up your year-end goals, enjoy a Mizzen and Main dress shirt that you can wear confidently. I like that they've very, very just nice, solid colors. I don't really like to get all fancy in patterns and everything, although they do have some pattern shirts, but very comfortable clothes, stretchable pants. It's just super comfortable, but they look professional, and you can wear them casually or professionally. I like some of their flannel shirts or untuck shirts. I love untuck. I never tuck in. So again, whether you're shopping for a special someone or giving yourself the gift you really want, I just buy myself gifts. Mizzen and Main is the perfect gift for any guy who works, travels, and cares about looking and feeling great. As you could tell by my many photos across the internet, I care about looking fantastic. I'm practically a model. And let's be honest, every guy loves to look great. So again, shop now at mizzenandmain.com and save 20% when you spend $130 or more using promo code James. That's promo code James at Mizzen and Main, Mizzen and Main.com. You know what I love about fantasy sports is that even though I'm not going to be a great basketball player or a baseball player or a football player or whatever, I feel like I get to participate and make decisions and use my knowledge of these different leagues or these different sports to compete. So it's like I can pick my team or I can pick my favorite players, and I could use my knowledge to make predictions and maybe even make money. So with the basketball season here, you can now pick combo projections across football and basketball from the Specials League on Prize Picks. This is a league created specifically for combo projections that include two or more players from different sports or leagues. Want to play alongside some of Prize Picks' favorite players like rapper Meek Mill and comedian Andrew Schultz, who's also been a guest on this podcast, and I've been a guest on his? You can now find community plays under the promos tab of the app to view entries for some of the biggest names in the Prize Picks community each week. Look, Prize Picks even offers a reboot policy so that your entries stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. For football and basketball games, if you have a player who exits the game in the first half and does not return in the second, that player is rebooted. Prize Picks is the only daily fantasy sports platform with an injury insurance policy. What? So I love playing it. I love anywhere where I can use analytical ability with my interests to demonstrate some skill and maybe make some money. And I like the game-like aspect. I do wish they had chess as a category on prizepicks.com, but I'll settle for what they've got. Maybe I should make my own fantasy chess league. But in any case, I love Prize Picks. Go to prizepicks.com/James. Use code James for a first deposit match up to $100. That's the easiest $100 you're ever going to make. So that's prizepicks.com/James and use code James. Daily fantasy sports made easy. The future of learning is definitely online. Like, it's such BS that you have to spend $200,000 or take $200,000 in loans and go to some fancy school when it's useless. It doesn't guarantee you a job. Most employers, including me, do not care about degrees or grades or anything like that. We want to care that you love what you're doing, that you know what you're doing, in some cases that you have experience or that you're willing to learn. But people in general love learning and are curious. Like, the key to success is curiosity. And I think masterclass.com is the perfect model for online learning. I'm really happy they're sponsoring this episode. If you're going to give a gift, give the gift of learning. Masterclass makes a meaningful gift this season for you and anyone on your list, because both of you can learn from the best to become your best, from leadership to effective communication to cooking. Let me tell you some of the classes I've taken. I've taken comedy from Steve Martin. I mean, can you believe I can take a class from Steve Martin on comedy, or Judd Apatow, my favorite comedy director? I could take an actual class from him on writing. Wolfgang Puck on cooking. Dan Brown on writing, or Judy Bloom, who's been on this podcast, on writing. By the way, Wolfgang Puck also has been on this podcast. It's such a pleasure. I try to take classes all the time from masterclass.com. And whether you're watching Masterclass on TV or listening in audio mode in the app or on their site, the quality speaks for itself. It's like these Masterclass instructors are your own personal mentors that are going to help you reach the next level. How much would it cost to take one-on-one classes on comedy from Steve Martin or on chess from Gary Kasparov? You just wouldn't be able to do it. But it would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. With a Masterclass annual membership, it's $10 a month. Memberships start at $120 a year for unlimited access to one-on-one classes with all 180 plus Masterclass instructors. So it's not just $120 for one instructor. You get all 180 plus Masterclass instructors. Boost your confidence and find practical takeaways you can apply to your life and at work. And if you own a business or are a team leader, use Masterclass to empower and create future-ready employees and leaders. That's the real education in today's world. So this holiday season, you can give one annual membership and get one free at masterclass.com/JAS. JAS, of course, stands for the James Altucher Show. So right now you can get two memberships for the price of one at masterclass.com/JAS. Masterclass.com/JAS. Offer terms apply.
There are certain things that are fundamentally analog and are very difficult to reproduce in our analog to digital conversion problem.
Right, but as you've mentioned in a prior podcast, there's actually nothing in the universe that's infinite.
Yes. Yeah, so nothing in terms of a physical property like density, temperature, pressure, etc. But what I'm saying is that you could look at the angle of the star Sirius over there, and then you could move, 1/1000th of a radian over, and then measure that position, and it should have moved by 1/1000th of a radian. But actually, you'll see it; it'll like chunk, like it'll be like a pixelization, like a staircase pattern of it, because they have to simulate the trajectory, and it has some fundamental resolution element that, by the way, has to be propagated throughout the entirety of the universe. So in other words, we're looking at light from the moon of Jupiter that we've been to, and that light has to progress to us along certain trajectories as the Earth moves around. That means that whoever is responsible program this light beam so that it reaches Brian Keating's telescope on this day at this time. They would have to know that with infinite precision where I'm going to be. In other words, they have to forecast all the different properties in order to produce the observations without revealing that it has this jagged staircase discretization in the analog to digital converter.
But that's doable.
Well, at some level, the computational cost will exceed the number of particles in the universe.
Right, that's the problem, but we don't really know. For instance, if they're using, hypothetically, quantum computing seems to be just a theory. Like, we don't even know if such a thing exists.
Mm-hmm.
But let's say hypothetically it exists. Now you really are using computational power drawn from an infinite number of universes. So no computation is beyond, possible.
Yeah. So there are predictions. There's actually a paper that kind of looks at this on test of the simulation theory. It's called On Testing the Simulation Theory. They, instead of using light from the moons of Jupiter, he's talking about there would be actual patterns that we could observe in the arrival of very high energy particles called ultra high energy cosmic rays, and that they would be discretized in a way. There's another work that's been done on how much resolution would you have on the opposite end of the scale. In other words, the properties of the proton and the neutron depend on the properties of quarks. To simulate those so that that Large Hadron Collider will produce the exact data that we think it should produce based on the models of this type of theory called lattice gauge theory. That is, basically, it could be infinite amount of computing power that's required for each collision, let alone to reproduce every collision that's ever occurred. Now, these aren't falsifications yet, but I think, the combination of these things could be used in some sense to the discretization of space-time events and propagation of light. For our purposes in the Big Bang Theory, it's something that currently has less weight because of its difficulty in falsifying it. In other words, as you said, like they could just make a more powerful computer, or it could be a multiverse where they simulate the laws of gravity and quantum chromodynamics in our universe, but then in another universe is totally different because the simulation started off with a different initial seed. I guess, for me, what's the motivation? And this actually couples into the religious, like, why did God create the universe? If you believe in God, again, I don't care. I usually say I don't know if I believe in God, but I believe in religion. So the difference in perspective is, what is the motivation for doing it? There's only a finite amount of energy in the universe that we can observe. And you have to wonder, what is the benefit of this? But the thing that tickles me is that some of the most, secular, atheistic people in the world, will posit things like the simulation hypothesis. I'm hoping to have Nick Bostrom on my podcast to discuss that very fact and whether or not there are these theological overtones in this model of origin.
Yeah, but if, again, thinking we invented our species has invented computers, 80 years ago, roughly? And it was built on some science that existed another 100 or so years before that. But if a civilization is 1 trillion years old in some other universe, pre-existing universe, they're going to be so far advanced in computational power, in things that we have no concept of. It's like explaining things to a baby for them to explain how it works. We just have, they might not be using computational power. They might be using something we have no concept of. And for them, it does, just like how we can create huge, almost infinitely sized computer games, then the world's in those. For them, trivial is creating a 13 billion year universe that started with a big bang and with gluons and quarks and all these things. And, I've seen this as the theory falsifying it, but that assumes a civilization kind of slightly more advanced than ours instead of a trillion years or a quadrillion years more advanced than ours.
Yeah, that's the problem. It's like we don't have any concept of what it would be like to go that far in advance. But the problem is that if you assume the simulation hypothesis is true, then that would have to be something that would be implanted into our branch of the simulation. And in that branch, we would be forced to think, well, we're not going to have this capability, but it seems likely, or we don't have this capability, but it seems likely, just apply some time. And, look, even if you look at something which is much simpler than creating the entire universe, creating life, let's just say, creating life, we have no idea how life actually originated. In other words, how protons formed into helium and hydrogen is much more well understood than how helium, hydrogen eventually form a star, which forms byproducts that forms phosphorus, nitrogen, carbon, etc., that then forms amino acids. In other words, we could also say that's a type of computing also. It's based on a genetic code. Just apply time and it will develop with Moore's law. But that's not the way biology. It's not like we have a doubling of number of species on Earth every year. That doesn't happen. In fact, the opposite happens.
Okay, but let's look at it like take a game like Grand Theft Auto. How do we know that we're not just a character in a quadrillion year upgrade of Grand Theft Auto?
Yeah, well, that's the basic problem of falsification. So Descartes got out of it by saying, that even if God was malicious, it would still not invalidate the aspect of free choice. In other words, he's choosing to torture me, but I am choosing how I react to being tortured in that way. Or I'm choosing how the existence of God and the existence of me means that I exist at least, even if God is malicious. So,
but a character in Grand Theft Auto, again, with an extra trillion years to making Grand Theft Auto, that character, from our perspective, is not real, but he or she might think he is real and thinking and has protons and atoms. He might be convinced, I think, therefore I am. And in fact, he might actually exist. Like that might be a real being, just happens to be in a computer code.
All right. Let's get back to simple things like the Big Bang, James.
Now that we're talking, I'm kind of thinking it's probably, why wouldn't we be in a simulation? Like other than we'll never have the computational power to make it. Let's just assume some other civilization can make it. Why isn't everything a simulation? Or how can, instead of trying to falsify it, is there any way to prove it?
Yes, so that is an interesting concept, and that we could definitely take up. But it also will be allied with some of the discussion that we're going to have about the multiverse, et cetera, because a lot of these would rely on kind of a larger kind of landscape on which the different ways that the laws of physics could play out, which are much simpler than constructing a sociological construct. I guess part of it would also be, well, how did the simulators get started? Like, who started them? Are you going to say that it's been going on for all time? What are the energy constraints on such a simulation? Those could be no-go theorems. Again, what we do mostly as scientists is not prove things. We look for ways to disprove all other alternatives, and what we're left with is essentially Occam's razor's best guess at the truth. And I would say there are many other, while this cannot be falsified necessarily, I am less sanguine that it's actually provable or even true.
But the Occam's razor, they make it, people who believe in the theory, for them, Occam's razor is that we're in a simulation because trillions of simulations that reflect worlds as real as ours have been created. If one has been created, then trillions have been created. And the real universe, again, is only one of those trillions of real seeming universes. And so the odds are the Occam's razor is that we are in a simulation. The odds would be enormous that we're not in a simulation.
Right. So the question comes, how do we, because in science, what we're going to try to do is falsify and show that this theory has defects in it. So there are two ways that people have proposed, as I said, looking at the very smallest things in the universe and then looking for properties in the universe in the largest scales. So the question is, if it really took this too far, you could say, well, let's say it is falsified. Well, maybe that's just what the simulation, that's how they cover their tracks. they show us that the universe is not a simulation, and then we find evidence for that, then we can say, well, that's exactly what they would want us to know so that we don't discover the truth of reality. So these problems for me are not super satisfying because, yes, you can't falsify them, but just in the same way, I feel like we can't falsify that the world got started by, a belching unicorn on the planet Neptune. There are interesting ways for me, mostly as an experimental physicist, look for ways you can prove it wrong. If there are no such ways, think harder about it. And Galileo said, measure what is measurable and make measurable what is not. So I kind of alter that and I say, falsify what is falsifiable and make falsifiable what is not. And so for me, I'm interested in these kinds of aspects of could you prove it wrong more than I am of like really fretting if it's not real. I think it would effectively be tantamount to some omniscient, omnipotent deity. And actually what interests me on a personal level is more kind of like the ethics of the simulators themselves. And even forget about the future. And this will be the last thing before I run to a group meeting of cosmologists. Even if it's not true, what if we can make, just human beings, James's and Brian's, what if we can make a really advanced simulation where people like the Grand Theft Auto, but then they're actually like sensations? Maybe like when a character gets shot, you blow up a capacitor, inside the computer or something, so it feels pain or like has some sensation. What are the ethics that we have of this? Can you turn it off? Can you turn off the simulation? Like you've lovingly crafted it? Not talking about, like how much money it would cost or whatever, but like, do human beings, will we ever get to a level where we have ethical obligations to silicon or to quantum qubits? I think that's really interesting to think about.
Let me add 1 minute of one idea, and this is based on conversations we've had before, is that the general trend of physics is to show more and more with each new level of theories how insignificant man is.
Yes.
So at first, it's like, oh, God probably doesn't look like a man. Then it's the sun probably doesn't circle the earth. Then the solar system's not the only thing in the universe. There's other stars and they don't orbit us. And then there's other galaxies that don't orbit us and on and on. And the final version of that would be that, hey, even our universe is just some other civilization's programs. And the people in that don't even know we exist. We're just like bits in some huge simulation they're doing. They don't even care about us.
Exactly. Yeah. So for us to think about that's extensions of what we call the Copernican principle. Are we the center? Is our biology central? That's another issue. Like, do we need carbon-based life in order to have life? Or is all life carbon-based? That's another anthropocentric kind of argument in terms of the chemistry space instead of physical space. And there are all sorts of these things, as you know. And so I think those are, and silicon, silicon in terms of computers. Is it only like squishy, wet things that can have intelligence? Or can we really have, human level artificial intelligence? And I think those are really fascinating things to consider.
All right. Well, Brian, enjoy your meeting with the cosmologists on a Friday evening, and all of these cosmologists getting trashed and smoking crack on now the week is over, and hopefully one of us will figure out how to. Scott Adams always talks about once you realize you're in a simulation, you can manipulate it more easily. That's a whole other function of this. But let's do another episode of How the Universe Began.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Your daily dose of gaming just got way more epic with the Snapdragon processor powering the Samsung Galaxy S23 Ultra. Snapdragon processors give you the premium mobile experience that triggers your inner champion. Whenever you want, wherever you want. Get ready for edge-of-your-seat performance, advanced customizations, ultra-realistic graphics, and adrenaline-boosting speeds that have the power to move you in more ways than one. Follow us on Instagram at Snapdragon Official.